In 1692, William Stirling, a stonemason from Edinburgh, led a team to the Tay Gorge near the village of Dunkeld, where the Crown had ordered a stone bridge to be built across the river. The road was to connect the forts in the Highlands, and the gorge was the last obstacle in the way of the royal troops through these lands. The gorge was wild, narrow, with sheer walls of black rock, and the river below flowed fast and cold even in the height of summer. The locals called this place Beul-an-Dhorchadas, the Gate of Darkness, and did not go there after sunset. We arrived at the construction site on the morning of June 23rd, when the fog still hung over the water and the sun had not yet reached the bottom of the gorge. As I recall now, I was 28 years old and served as a cartographer for the Royal Road Construction Authority. My job was to keep records of the progress of the work, draw up maps of the area, and record the consumption of materials for the Crown Archives. I had studied in Aberdeen for 2 years and previously served as an assistant surveyor in Perth, where I recorded the boundaries of estates and marked out fields. The work in the gorge was my first royal appointment, and I kept a daily journal, noting the weather, the condition of the stone, and the behavior of the workers. Our camp was located on the south bank, where a 20-foot-wide stone platform allowed us to store tools and materials under a tarpaulin canopy. William Stirling was the chief mason, a man of about 45 with broad shoulders and hands scarred from stone and tools. He wore a leather apron even when he was not working and always carried a folding brass square with him. Andrew MacLeod served as a military engineer sent from Fort William to supervise the construction of the road. He was tall and silent, with a clean-shaven face and a manner of looking at the terrain as if it were a battlefield. He carried a compass in a brass case and a leather-bound notebook. Father Cameron was a supervising priest appointed by the bishop to bless the work and oversee the moral condition of the brigade. He was short, with a graying beard and a habit of reading prayers aloud every evening. He held wooden rosary beads in his hands and often ran his fingers through them. Donald and Ian McGregor were brothers and stonemasons from Inverness, both broad-boned with calloused hands and identical scars on their left forearms from a slipping chisel. Donald smoked a pipe even while working. Ian wore leather arm guards, polished to a shine. Finlay MacDonald was a local Gaelic guide who knew every trail and ford in these mountains. Thin, with long black hair and a way of walking silently even on stones. He spoke English with a strong accent and often switched to Gaelic when he was nervous. 3 laborers, Hugh, Malcolm, and Robert, were hired in Dunkeld to carry stone and do odd jobs. Young men with no particular skills but strong backs and a willingness to work for pennies. We began work at first light the next morning, while the fog still hung thick. MacLeod and I marked out both banks, driving stakes with ropes to indicate the lines of the piers. The distance between the banks was 48 feet. The depth of the stream in the center was about 8 feet, and the current was fast and cold even in June. The stone for the foundation was brought from a quarry upriver on carts, then dumped at the water's edge, where stonemasons worked it with hammers and chisels to shape it. The sound of steel on stone echoed from the walls of the gorge from morning to evening, sharp and monotonous. The first 2 days were spent preparing the foundation. Workers cleared the riverbed of silt and boulders, installing wooden guides for laying the stone. The weather remained gray and damp. The sun rarely reached the bottom of the gorge, and even at noon the light was dim as if shining through dirty glass. Fog rose every morning and lingered until midday, turning the workers' figures into vague shadows. We worked slowly and carefully because the stone was slippery from moisture and the current was strong. Stirling supervised the laying of each block, checking the angles with a square and the level with a plumb line. MacLeod stood on the bank and watched, writing something in his notebook. Father Cameron walked among the workers and said prayers over the stones before they were laid. I kept records and made sketches, noting the dimensions of the blocks and the position of the supports. On the 3rd day, when the sun was high and the fog had cleared, Finlay approached Stirling and said that the locals did not come near this place after sunset. Stirling asked why. Finlay replied that there had once been a ford here, and the old people said that the keeper of the ford demanded payment. Stirling laughed and said that the royal crown was the only keeper he recognized. Finlay did not smile. He looked at the water and said that the toll had always been paid in bones, and that the bridge might not please those who had lived here before humans. MacLeod ordered him to return to work and not to confuse the workers with superstitions. By the evening of the 4th day, the first pier had been laid on the south bank. The stones were tightly fitted, the joints filled with tow and lime, and the structure looked solid. We celebrated with an extra portion of whiskey from McLeod's flask, and Stirling said that by the end of the following week, the central pier would be in place at the bottom of the river. The work was progressing faster than expected. We went to sleep to the monotonous and unchanging sounds of the river. On the 5th morning, when the workers went down to the water, Ian McGregor shouted and pointed to the south pier. The top 3 stones were gone. The blocks, each weighing 200 pounds, were simply missing, as if they had never been laid. The joints below were intact, the lime dry, but the stones were gone without a trace. We searched the shore and the water downstream, thinking they might have fallen and floated away, but found nothing. Stirling examined the masonry and said that the stones could not have fallen on their own. They had been laid correctly and secured. McLeod suggested that the locals might have taken them at night to disrupt the construction. Finlay shook his head and said that no one from Dunkeld would approach this gorge in the dark. We replaced the stones and continued working. Stirling ordered Hugh and Malcolm to keep watch at the pier at night to catch the thieves if they returned. The workers built a fire on the shore and sat by it until midnight but saw nothing. On the morning of the 6th day, the stones were gone again, this time 4 blocks from the top of the pier. Hugh said they had not left the fire and had not slept, but had heard nothing but the river. Malcolm added that the cold intensified closer to midnight, even though there was no wind, and the fog rose so thick that they could barely see the water 10 feet away. Stirling ordered the central support to be laid while he dealt with the southern one. The work in the river was harder. The water was waist deep, the current knocked them off their feet, and the stones had to be lowered on ropes from the bank. Donald and Ian worked in the water, guiding the blocks into place while the others passed them down from above. By midday, the first row of the central pier had been laid. The stones lay on the cleared bed, and Stirling checked the level twice before ordering them to continue. The smell appeared on the 7th day. I noticed it in the morning when I went down to the water with my sketch pad. The smell was thick, damp, reminiscent of wet wool left to rot in a warm place, mixed with something fishy and rotten. It didn't come from a single point, but seemed to permeate the air at the water's edge. I thought that somewhere upstream, a sheep or deer might have died and been washed up on the rocks. Stirling also smelled it and sent Robert to walk along the bank upstream to find the source, but Robert came back with nothing. The smell lingered all day, intensifying in the evening when the fog rose from the water again. On the 8th day, while Donald and Ian were working on the central pier, we heard a sound. It was a deep growl, low and long, echoing off the stone walls. The sound came from somewhere below, from the water or from under the rocks, and repeated at irregular intervals. 3 or 4 seconds of sound, then silence, then again. The workers stopped and listened. Finlay said it wasn't an animal. Neither a bear nor a deer made such sounds. McLeod suggested that it was water passing through the voids under the stones, creating resonance. Stirling ordered the work to continue, but the sound continued throughout the day, interrupted only by short intervals. On the 9th day, Ian found tracks. He was working at the water's edge on the north bank, clearing a spot for the second support, when he noticed prints in the river silt. The tracks were deep, clear, with 6 toes on each and about a foot long. The shape was broad, almost circular, with long claws that left furrows in the soft clay. The tracks led from the water to the edge of the stone platform and back, as if something had come out of the river, surveyed the camp, and returned. McLeod measured the prints and recorded the dimensions. He said it could be a bear, deformed or with extra toes from a congenital deformity. Finlay shook his head and said that bears had not been seen in these parts for 100 years, and no animal had 6 toes. I couldn't sleep that night. The smell grew stronger, almost unbearable, thick and suffocating. I lay in my tent and listened to the river. But behind the monotonous sound of the water, I could hear something else. Heavy breathing, slow and wet, as if something large was standing at the edge of the camp and watching. I didn't go out to check. My hands were shaking as I pulled the blanket up higher. On the 10th day, Donald went down to the central support to check the masonry and found a den under the stones. The space under the central support, where the water flowed faster and deeper, was partially blocked by a large boulder, leaving a cavity the size of a small room. Donald saw it when he bent down to look at the lower stones. He shouted and we came over. Inside the cavity lay bones, sheep ribs and skulls, deer legs, and 3 human skulls with broken backs. The bones were arranged in a circle as if intentionally, not scattered but neatly stacked. In the center of the circle lay a stone covered with dark spots that could have been blood or rust. The smell from the cavity was unbearable. Rot, wool, fish, all mixed together into a heavy, suffocating stench. Father Cameron examined the lair and said that the place was unclean. He ordered the bones to be removed and burned, and the cavity to be filled with stones. Finlay said that the place should not be touched. If the guardian of the ford had laid the bones there, it was a payment, and it was dangerous to disturb it. MacLeod ordered him to be quiet and help the others. We pulled out the bones, piled them on the shore, and doused them with tar. Father Cameron said a prayer, and Stirling set the pile on fire. The bones burned slowly, with black smoke and a sweetish smell. When the fire went out, we filled the cavity with stones and continued laying the foundation. That night, the sound returned. The growling was louder, closer, as if something was standing at the edge of the light from the fire, watching. We sat in camp and no one spoke. Hugh said he saw a shadow between the tents. Tall, broad, moving on two legs, but bent over as if ready to drop to all fours. Malcolm added that the shadow stopped at the edge of the fire, stood for a few seconds, then walked back toward the river. I didn't see anything, but I heard heavy footsteps. Not human, slower, with a weight that made the stones creak. On the 11th day, Robert did not come out of the tent. We found him lying on his side with his eyes open, but he did not respond to questions and did not move when we shook his shoulder. His breathing was even, his pulse weak, but he did not respond to light or sound. Father Cameron said it might be fever or shock. MacLeod ordered him carried to the tent and left under guard until he came to. Robert lay there until evening, then suddenly got up, dressed, and went out to the river. He said he remembered nothing from the night before, but felt that something was calling him, drawing him to the water, and he could hardly resist going. The central support grew slowly. By the 12th day, it had risen 4 feet above the water, and Stirling said that in 2 more days they could begin laying the arch. The work was difficult because the water was getting colder every day, even though it was July. Donald and Ian worked in the water for an hour, then climbed out to warm themselves by the fire. But the cold did not go away. They said that the water below was even colder, as if there were ice at the bottom, even though the current was fast and should have warmed the water with its movement. On the 13th night, I was on watch by the fire with Hugh. We sat with our backs to the fire, looking at the water and listening to the river. The fog was so thick that visibility was no more than 10 steps. The cold numbed my fingers, even though the fire was burning hot. Around midnight, I heard something enter the water upstream. The splash was heavy and deep, as if a large body had plunged in from the bank. Then silence, only the river. Hugh whispered for me to listen. The sound repeated itself. A splash, a pause, then a slow movement of the water, as if something was floating downstream toward us. I couldn't see anything in the fog, but I could feel the air becoming heavier, colder, and the smell intensifying so much that it was difficult to breathe. A shape emerged from the fog on the opposite bank. It was large, broad, standing on 2 legs, but leaning forward as if supported by long arms. The head was massive, with a broad, flat muzzle and erect ears. The eyes glowed dimly yellow in the light of the fire, without pupils, flat and cold. Its fur, if it was fur, hung in shreds, wet and dark. I could see its shoulders and upper chest, the rest hidden by the fog and distance. The shape stood motionless for a few seconds, then turned and walked back into the fog. Its steps were heavy, slow, with pauses, as if it were checking the ground in front of it. Hugh whispered for me not to move. We sat until dawn, not leaving the fire. In the morning, I told Stirling what I had seen. He asked if it could have been a bear. I said bears don't stand on 2 legs for so long and don't have eyes like that. MacLeod said it could have been a man in a skin, a local trying to scare us and disrupt our work. Finlay shook his head and said no man wears a skin with a head like that, and eyes can't glow like that without fire. On the 14th day, we began laying the first arch. Wooden scaffolding was erected between the supports, and stone was laid on it, forming a semicircular vault. The work required precision. Each stone had to fit tightly so that the arch would hold without mortar until the joints were finally sealed. Donald and Ian worked on the scaffolding, guiding the stones, while the others fed them from below on ropes. By evening, the first row of the arch had been laid. Stirling inspected the work and said that in 3 more days the bridge would be ready. That night, Malcolm disappeared. He left the tent around midnight, saying he was going to relieve himself and did not return. We searched for him until dawn. We walked along the shore, inspected the camp, checked the water, but found no trace of him. His clothes were left in the tent. His boots were at the entrance. Finley said he had gone to the water and not returned, like everyone else the keeper had taken. MacLeod ordered the search to continue during the day, but we found nothing. No body, no clothes, no signs of a struggle. On the 15th day, Ian refused to work on the scaffolding. He said he felt something watching him from the water when he stood over the stream. Stirling ordered Hugh to replace him, but Hugh also refused. Work stopped. MacLeod stepped forward and said that if no one wanted to continue, he would finish the bridge himself. But the Crown had no tolerance for cowards and deserters. Donald looked at him for a long time, then picked up a hammer and returned to the scaffolding. I followed him because the records required my presence. We worked in silence. The river flowed fast below, cold and black. Fog rose in patches, obscuring the banks. The smell became constant, thick, suffocating. The stones were laid slowly because our hands were shaking and our breathing was uneven. By midday, the second row of the arch was complete, and all that remained was to lay the keystone, the last block that locks the arch. When we lifted the keystone with ropes, the water under the bridge began to bubble. Bubbles rose from the bottom, large and slow, as if something was breathing below. The current changed. Instead of flowing straight, the water began to swirl around the central support, forming a funnel. Donald froze, holding the stone in midair. I told him to lower it quickly. He nodded and began to lay it down, but the stone did not fit into place, as if something was holding it from below, preventing it from resting on the adjacent blocks. The shape rose from the water under the bridge. I could see its head, broad, flat, with a snout covered in wet fur. Its eyes were yellow, without eyelids, its pupils narrow vertical slits. Its nostrils flared, and its breath came out as steam, smelling of rotting fish. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing teeth, long, uneven, black at the base. Its arms rose out of the water, long, with 6 fingers, claws black and thick. It grabbed the edge of the forest and pulled down. The tree creaked. Donald screamed and threw the stone. The block fell into the water with a heavy splash. The forest tilted. I grabbed the rope, but it snapped, and I flew forward. The water hit me with its coldness, knocking the breath out of me. The current picked me up and dragged me down. I paddled toward the shore, but my arms wouldn't obey me. Something touched my leg, heavy, cold, with a force that could break bone. I jerked away, broke free, and my hands found a rock on the shore. I climbed out, lay on my back, and breathed through my mouth. Donald got out too. He lay next to me, wet and shivering. The scaffolding hung halfway in the water, twisted. The keystone was gone. The water calmed down, the fog thickened, and I couldn't see anything anymore. Stirling ordered work to stop for the day. We returned to camp, built a large fire, and sat around it until evening. No one spoke. Father Cameron read prayers, fingering his rosary. Finley sat apart, staring at the water. Malcolm returned during the night. He emerged from the fog, wet, naked, his eyes empty. He didn't speak or answer questions, just stood at the edge of the fire and stared into the flames. MacLeod threw a blanket over him and sat him closer to the heat. Malcolm sat motionless until dawn, then spoke. He said he had gone to the water because he heard a call, low, deep, calling his name. He entered the river and walked downstream, feeling no cold. The water covered his head, but he breathed as if the air were around him. He saw the bottom, rocks, bones, old things covered in silt. He saw a shape standing on the bottom, large, broad, with eyes that did not blink. The shape took him by the hand and led him further into the darkness, where the water was blacker than night. Then he woke up on the shore, not remembering how he got out. On the 16th day, Stirling said that the bridge would be completed no matter what. MacLeod agreed. Father Cameron suggested performing a blessing ceremony before continuing the work, but Stirling refused. He said that the Crown did not pay for prayers, but for stone and mortar. We returned to the water, raised the scaffolding, and began laying the stones again. The work went faster because the fear had receded. Our hands moved mechanically, without thinking. By the evening of the 17th day, the keystone was in place. The arch was complete. Stirling checked the joints, filled them with mortar, and said the bridge would hold a loaded cart. MacLeod recorded the completion date in his book. Father Cameron said a short prayer. We stood on the bridge and looked down at the black water. That night, the sound stopped. The smell disappeared. The fog cleared, and the stars were visible above the gorge for the first time in 2 weeks. We sat by the fire, and the air was clean, light, without the heaviness that had weighed on us all this time. The river flowed calmly, monotonously, like a normal river. I thought it was all over. On the 18th day, we gathered our tools and left the gorge. The bridge stood strong. The stones lay tightly. The joints were filled. Stirling said it was good work and the crown would be pleased. We returned to Dunkeld by evening, and I wrote my final notes in my journal, noting the completion of the construction and the loss of one worker. Hugh did not live to see winter. He fell ill with fever in August and died in September, raving about water and eyes watching from the darkness. Malcolm left Dunkeld and no one knew where he went. Robert got married and moved to Perth, where he worked at a mill, but it was said that he would not go near the river and avoided bridges. Donald and Ian returned to Inverness and never worked on bridges again. Finlay disappeared in the mountains the following spring, and his body was found only in the summer, a mile from the gorge with a broken skull. Father Cameron served in Dunkeld for another 3 years, then requested a transfer to Edinburgh, explaining to the bishop that his health required a change of climate. MacLeod continued his service at Fort William and never mentioned the gorge in his reports. Stirling accepted several more royal commissions but refused to work in mountainous areas, preferring urban projects. I returned to Perth and continued my service as a cartographer. I handed over the records of the bridge's construction to the Royal Archives, but did not include the last pages of the journal where I described what I had seen underwater. I kept these pages separately in a sealed envelope, not knowing what to do with them. The bridge served for 30 years. Military units crossed it without incident. Carts carrying cargo crossed the gorge safely, and the road functioned as the Crown had planned. But the locals avoided the bridge, preferring the old trail through the mountains, even though it was 2 days longer. They said they heard sounds coming from under the bridge at night, the scraping of claws on stone, heavy breathing, deep growls echoing in the stone arches. Travelers who stopped for the night at the bridge said they saw shadows under the arches, moving against the current of the water, and smelled wet wool and rotting fish rising from the river. In 1722, the bridge was widened to accommodate heavier carts. While dismantling part of the southern pier, workers found 3 skeletons in a walled-up niche. The bones were clutching masons' tools, a hammer, a chisel, and a square. The skulls were intact, without damage, but the bones of the hands were broken in many places, as if the skeletons had tried to escape from the stone trap. There are no records of who they were.